What would happen if I told you that Ferrari's car, considered throughout the season as a nightmare to drive, became a perfect extension of Hamilton's talent? And it was not magic, it was pure science. Are you ready to discover what not even Ferrari understood of his own car? Ferrari arrived in Monza dragging a known narrative, that of a complex, capricious and fundamentally unstable car. Throughout the first half of the season, the SF25 had been an enigma for its own engineers. He was fast in some sectors, erratic in others. His performance seemed to depend more on the conditions of the wind or the humor of the tires than the strategic effort of Ferrari. The worst was not its irregularity, but the total unpredictability with which it punished any attempt to take it to the limit. For many inside the paddock, it was a machine that simply had no soul. A car that didn't inspire confidence. But in Monza, everything changed. It was not a quick lap. It was not an epic surpass. It was a fragment of information. A data buried among thousands of telemetry lines that, when interpreted correctly, triggered a chain reaction in Ferrari. On the 27th of the Grand Prix, during the passage through the iconic Lesmo 2 curve, the minimum speed of Hamilton was 2 km/h higher than that of the McLaren. But that figure in itself was not what ignited the alarms. The truly disconcerting was the analysis of the steering wheel, an absolutely clean, soft and visible corrections. A reading that challenged all previous experiences with the SF25. Ferrari engineers, gathered in the control room, reviewed the data again and again. They contrasted it with previous turns. They compared it to Leclerc's records. And what they found was as unexpected as revealing. For the first time in the whole season, the SF25 behaved like a balanced car. There were no strange vibrations, there were no sudden losses of adhesion in the rear, and most importantly, there was no out-of-control thermal degradation. The temperature curve of Hamilton's rear tires remained inside a window of just 5 degrees throughout the race. Leclerc, in comparison, dealt with variations of up to 12. That difference explained everything. Not only did it reveal a better control of the career rhythm, but a complete domain of the dynamic behavior of the car. It was as if Hamilton was operating a different car from his partners. And in part that was true. Not because of the machine itself, but because of the use of it. The information baffled Ferrari because it implied something that they were not prepared to assume, that their problems were not exclusively mechanical. They were operational. Strategic humans, everything that had been diagnosed as a structural defect, from the unstable balance to the impossibility of keeping the heat of the tires, was being controlled by Hamilton with tools that the equipment did not know how to use. And that was the real break. Because at that time, Ferrari stopped wondering what failed the car, and began to wonder what Hamilton was doing that they did not understand. In modern Formula One, the limits are not only defined by the technical regulations, but by the psychological margin that pilots are willing to cross. And Monza 2025 showed us that this threshold can be redefined when a pilot decides that fear will not be part of the learning process. Because what Lewis Hamilton did that weekend was not just adjusting a car. It was to challenge all operational logic within Ferrari. In the usual technical meeting on Friday morning, when the engineers presented the 3 recommended configurations for that circuit, a neutral, a conservative, and an experimental discarded by almost all simulators, Hamilton made a decision that paralyzed the room. He directly requested the most aggressive option. An extreme differential configuration with total opening at the curve input and a brutal blockade at the output. What for others was a risk zone, for him it was a training field. During free training, his approach was methodical. It was not about cleaning clean or marking times. It was about provoking the car. To push it until it reacted. To understand, curve, where were the rupture points of the SF25 and how to manipulate them in their favor. Each sliding, every momentary tensile loss was not a mistake. It was information. The language that the car offered him. Hamilton absorbed it, interpreted it, incorporated it into his nervous system. He used discomfort as a map and instability as a compass. Most pilots build confidence in the stability of the car. Hamilton did the opposite. He built control in instability. He did not seek to domesticate SF25, but learned to dance with his chaos. In his head, there was no dangerous curve, just a choreography not yet rehearsed enough. Friday data showed an unpublished pattern in Ferrari's records. Curve inputs with a higher rotation speed than any other pilot on the grille, accompanied by a surprising reduction of corrections in the direction. The car rotated in block without the need for micro-adjusts, thanks to surgical use of the motor brake and weight transfer. It was as if Hamilton had found a new dimension of the car. An alternative way of driving it that did not depend on its stability, but on its ability to be read and reinterpreted curve after curve. The most revealing of all is that this configuration was not possible thanks to improvements in the car. There were no aerodynamic updates or changes in suspensions or new pieces in the transmission. It was pure and exclusively a matter of piloting, of mental approach, of error resistance. Most teams treat the car as an instrument that must adapt to the pilot. Hamilton treated SF25 as a living creature that should be understood. And in that understanding, he found a way to do what no one else had achieved until then, transforming a broken car into an extension of his own intuition. This was the real secret behind Hamilton's performance in Monza. It was not pure speed. It was a brave technical choice, a perfect execution of a pilot style that only a handful of people in history have been able to dominate. And with that, what seemed crazy in Friday data became the basis for one of the most refined performances of the year. Another central point of his writings was thermal management in long batches. While team sensors reported general values, Hamilton focused on fluctuations within the operating range of each tire, pointing out how the interaction between compounds, atmospheric pressure, and the tuning of the differential modified the way in which the car transferred longitudinal load. These types of observations did not appear in the standard graphics of the equipment, but they began to coincide with isolated anomalies that the technical departments had failed to connect with each other. Reports also included specific proposals for A/B tests on the track. Details such as changing the regenerative brake modulation in certain sectors, altering the MGUK energy strategy in linked curves, or experimenting with minimal variations in the roke of the car to verify the impact on the flow of the rear diffuser. These were not random suggestions. They were experiments raised as part of a larger plan, transforming the chaos of the SF25 into a surgical precision tool. And that was what happened in Monza. The configuration we saw was not just a product of a brilliant session of telemetry. It was the accumulated result of weeks of data collection, cross-analysis, and high-level strategic conversations between Hamilton and the most influential brains of Ferrari. In many ways, Hamilton was not just driving a Ferrari. He was helping to design him from within. The impact of these documents was so deep that, after Monza, several members of the technical team began to rethink fundamental concepts of SF25. Not because Hamilton had more data, but because he had more context. Because I could unite the theory with the practice in a way that no other pilot on the grill has demonstrated this season. And that is where the true magnitude of your contribution is understood. What nobody showed you about Hamilton's car was not on the rear spoiler or suspension configuration. I was in the content of those reports. How he managed to listen, understand, and act based on a different vision of the car. A vision that he was building curve after curve. Hamilton is not only changing Ferrari's narrative in 2025. He is redefining what he means to be a pilot in the modern era of Formula One. It is no longer just a matter of talent. It is a matter of knowledge. What we saw in Monza was not simply a great individual performance. It was the revelation of a technical, psychological, and human phenomenon that transcends any sector or podium statistics. Because the important thing was not that Hamilton ran fast, but ran differently. And in that nuance, in that almost invisible difference for the average eye, resides the true revolution of what happened that weekend in Italy. Monza was the mirror that forced Ferrari to look straight ahead. 4 months, the internal speech had been one of resignation. The car was unstable, unpredictable, unable to generate confidence in its pilots. But Hamilton shattered that narrative. Not with words, not with statements, but with data. With action. With the way he drew each curve, how he handled the temperature of his tires, how he anticipated the changes in car behavior back after return. The most disconcerting for Ferrari was not to discover that the car could do well. It was discovering that the car already had the potential, and that no one had known how to read it. Because the difference was not in aerodynamics or in the suspension, or in a miraculous improvement introduced in the flat bottom. The difference was in the ability to observe, adapt, and transfer knowledge of a pilot who decided not to complain about the problem, but to become part of the solution. This episode leaves us a powerful teaching, both for the engineers of the category and for fans who follow each tenth of a second with obsession. Formula One is not a data war, it is a war of interpretation. All equipment has access to telemetry, simulations, wind tunnels, predictive software. But not everyone has a pilot capable of translating that information into real tactical decisions into the car. And, much less, out of it. Lewis Hamilton showed that there is still a dimension of F1 that cannot be measured by sensors or replicated by artificial intelligence. It is the visceral understanding of the car. The use of error as a tool for evolution. The ability to anticipate what has not yet been calculated. That is the difference between a pilot who executes and one that transforms. For Monza, the SF25 ceased to be the problematic car of Paddock. Not because his design has changed, but because someone was able to change the way he was understood.